Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, I'm joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. What's Really Happening will take you behind the scenes and open the door to the knowledge, experience, and insights of a senior leader who's commanded at the highest levels of the U.S. military, including U.S. Central Command. On this episode, we're going to provide an update for the war in Ukraine. Several weeks ago, Congress passed and the president signed into law a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine. Recently, President Biden has announced that Ukraine can now use U.S. weapons to strike within Russia proper. All this as a new front line is developed north of Kharkiv. To better understand these impacts on the war, I'm going to turn it over to General McKenzie. All right. Good afternoon, General. Welcome back.
Good to be with you here today, Ted.
All right, let's start off with the latest in the news. So President Biden has announced that U.S. weapons given to Ukraine can now be used against the Russian mainland. What does that mean for the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's just a recognition that war has got to be fought in depth. You can't fight directly to your front. You've got to reach back to the command post. You've got to reach back to the marshaling areas. You got to reach back to the logistics support elements. To approach it in any other way is, frankly, a Pollyannish view of war.
Right.
And we're seeing the fruit of that approach being borne out today as Ukraine suffers because so much of the Russian war machine is off limits. Now, there's a risk with that, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yes,
there are risks that attend this decision, but it is disappointing that it took us so long to get to this point.
Well, and a lot of other allies have also allowed now Ukraine to use their weapon systems against Ukraine, or against Russia rather. And that brings up the point: what risk comes with that? What's Putin's red line where it becomes too much, and then the Russians do something more drastic?
So we're dealing with one person and one person only.
Right.
There's no decision-making process in Russia that doesn't involve Vladimir Putin sitting in a room alone. So I think we should recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would think that things that attack the Russian capability for nuclear warning of U.S. attack and things that directly are associated with a Russian nuclear arsenal, those would be the things that would be a red line for him. Just my observation and observation of past Russian Soviet behavior would lead me to believe that. So I think that we will be very clear with our Ukrainian friends as they begin these strikes that they need to be these do need to be off the table. I believe that would tend to significantly escalate the risk of Russian miscalculation.
Sure. And do you see any other red lines being crossed? Maybe Ukrainian troops crossing the line in the Sumy region or something, crossing the international border with Russia?
I think that probably, yes.
Right.
But I think at the very top would be things that talk directly to Russia's nuclear warning systems and Russia's ability and Russia's core nuclear capabilities.
Right. And as we look at the new aid package that the U.S. has recently approved a few weeks ago to Ukraine, so $61 billion, $25 billion directly for the military. How's that going to affect the battlefield right now?
I think it'll take a little time to affect the battlefield. These things aren't felt immediately. I think it's going to replenish a lot of their artillery ammunition. Some of the new attack missile ammunition that's going to go in is going to be very helpful. But we should not expect this to have immediate effect. And I think that may be a mistake. People expecting the tide to turn here. It took a little while for the tide to turn against Ukraine because of our unwillingness to provide this capability. I think it will take a little bit of time for it to reassert itself. Although, let's be clear, Russia has its own set of problems too, and we should recognize that.
Yeah, and there's a number of experts talking about this might be just a rebuild year for Ukraine, where they take this equipment, they get training, they conscript more people, and then they do a major attack in 25. Is that?
Well, it could be. Of course, the Russians hold the other half of the equation.
Right.
And a lot of people it's not a business deal we're talking about here. The Russians may not get the memo that they're not supposed to attack.
Right.
Russia has problems, though. They're still under-resourcing their military. Their military is still under-trained, and it's frankly still under-equipped. And I know we're seeing, Iranian drones flying. I know we're seeing increased Russian use of electromagnetic capabilities. But I would argue Russia is still eating into Cold War reserve stocks. And tanks are getting older. They're not getting better. And I think that still is a factor that they've got to weigh, given that Putin does not want to take the step to mobilization that would allow him to actually channel his economy into this, and it's a weak economy. It's a terrible economy. And he doesn't want to upset his people. So he's in a difficult place. He's trying to fight a war on the cheap, not unlike Lyndon Johnson did in Vietnam, frankly, where you didn't want to declare you didn't want to mobilize, you didn't want to declare a state of national emergency, you didn't want to do a variety of things that you could have done to expand the war. Putin has the same set of challenges in front of him right now, and he is not choosing to reach for those tools in his kit bag.
Right, because instead, after his presidential election, which he surprisingly won, he was started doing a turnover of a lot of military leadership. So we
Right.
saw the defense minister, another number of other people turn over to new positions, and these new line of leaders step up. Is there something going on there? The news has called it a purge, but other experts have said it's just him trying to find more competent
I
individuals.
think in the defense minister position, he's brought in a guy that first of all is loyal because
Right,
unless you're painfully loyal, you're not even in the consideration for it.
right,
But I think he's brought in someone who he believes will perhaps understand the economics of the situation better.
sure.
I'm not sure that understanding the economics of the situation with a through the lens of central planning is the way to get better here.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also very comfortable with the person. I think he was comfortable with Shoigu before.
Hmm.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with General Gerasimov.
Right, because he's the general chief of staff,
He's
still in
still
charge.
chief of the general staff and
Yeah.
still very much in place.
Right. Well, and some other signs that Russia might be needing troops, or again going off, like you said, in some troubled times, that they brought the Africa Corps in, or the Africa Corps, which they're old Wagner mercenaries
Right.
mostly, but they brought them in for the offensive on the northern Kharkiv front, which is relatively new. Is that an indication that they might be needing soldiers, or they're running low?
I would read it as very much so as an
Hmm.
indication that they need soldiers. This is where Putin is threatened the most. This is where you bring in your most loyal, your most capable forces, and there's a price to be paid when you do that
Hmm.
because they're not where they were and they can't do the things they were doing. And there's a limited pool of these mercenaries,
Right.
and I think all of these things are factors that are going to bear on Russia in the weeks ahead.
And as we look at Ukraine also needing more soldiers for the front line, we see a new Ukrainian
Yep.
conscription law coming in, lowering the age from 27 to 25. So now anyone in Ukraine, 25 to 60, any male, is up for eligibility for conscription. Is that Ukraine trying to again beef up for a possible offense, or is it just more steady state, just holding the
I
line?
think it's overdue,
Hmm.
first of all, and but I think they're just trying to survive right now. I
Right.
think certainly they vision an offense in the future, and that very possibly will happen. I hope it does happen. It needs to happen. But I think right now they need to concentrate on blunting the Russian attacks,
Hmm.
recovering equilibrium along the front,
Right.
and then think about what goes on from there. And I think hopefully that's where their focus is. They don't need to be thinking about offensive stuff yet. Maybe some backroom planning going on,
Hmm. Sure.
but they need to fight the fight they've got right now, which is a significant fight.
Sure, absolutely. And as we talk Ukrainian strategy and we look at U.S. strategy, looking back at the aid package, one interesting thing in the legislative verbiage for this aid package that just passed a few weeks ago was that it states in there that Congress, within 45 days, should receive, quote, a strategy regarding U.S. Support for Ukraine against Russian Federation aggression that shall be multi-year, establish specific, achievable objectives, define and prioritize United States national security interests, and include metrics that would be used to measure progress in achieving such objectives, end quote. So is U.S. lawmakers trying, or are U.S. lawmakers trying to establish, measurable goals for U.S. aid, and how's that going to look, in
Well,
your
Ted,
opinion?
presumably the Department of Defense has already done that.
Right,
As
exactly.
you enter any military plan,
Mhm.
execute any military plan, you would have exactly the things that Congress has asked for that would be part of that planning. I'm not privy to it, so I don't
Sure.
know. So I think that material should be there. I would hope it's there.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we're just pouring money away. You should have a vision of what you want the end state to be. That's fundamental military planning. And there are very good planners inside the Joint Staff and inside the Department of Defense. So presumably that information is there. Now, whether that's going to go to the Congress, I think, is a matter of is a political issue, not a military issue.
Well, and again, obviously, Ukraine gets a vote here as well on what their strategy would be as
That's correct.
the
And we've had trouble understanding. We've had trouble. Let me rephrase that. We've had trouble with Ukraine sharing their strategy with us,
right.
um, and we need to get beyond that because we're pumping a lot of $61 billion into Ukraine. We certainly have a right to know how our money's being spent.
Sure, absolutely. And as we look at that in general, how would that unfold about getting closer ties with Ukraine based on this? Is it
So
more.
I think we've got pretty good ties with Ukraine right now. I
Mhm.
think we have. I think we should just we should continue the interchanges at the mill level because I think you're going to get a lot of this in the mill to mill
Mhm.
exchange that's going on. At the same time, you maybe need to do a little more work on the political level going forward.
And speaking of the strategy, and obviously the U.S. and other allies looking for Ukraine to strike within Russia, like you mentioned, those logistical nodes in the rear. Is this unlike what the U.S. had to deal with in the Korean War, where MacArthur and other generals were calling for more strikes within China and trying to restrict it? So, how does that restriction of the battle zone play out on the ground?
Sure. So in Korea in particular, Douglas MacArthur wanted to strike north of the Yalu, wanted to
Mhm.
strike into China. He was never given permission to do that because of the possibility of widening the war.
Right.
So that's a counterfactual. We'll never know what would have happened had he done that.
Sure.
I will tell you that terrain, combat capabilities, and the way the military is organized is very different in Western Russia than it is in
Mhm.
in North Korea and in
Mhm.
China. So I would expect deep strikes to have more effect in the current conflict
Mhm.
than they might have had in China. For one thing, our aviation capabilities are significantly enhanced,
Sure.
and our deep intelligence capabilities are significantly enhanced over what we had in the mid-stage Korean War that we're discussing now. So I think we certainly should expect to have significant effects with this if we begin to strike into Russia. At the same time, and as we've already discussed, you need to be very careful what you strike and what you don't strike because of the possibility of inadvertent escalation.
Right. Right. And as we're looking at strikes within Russia, zooming back to the front line, what's your take on the current front line situation? So you in the East Donbass, you have some small Russian gains, and then obviously the new front, which is a few weeks old now, north of Kharkiv. What's the Russians'
So
gameplan here?
I think they want to drive on Kharkiv. I think the problem they've got right now is the same problem they've had before. The troops aren't highly motivated.
Mm.
Their attacks are not necessarily well coordinated. Sure, you can bring in the mercenaries and
Mhm.
they'll push other people to fight for a while, but we've seen that's not an endless boost for you as you come in. So I think Russia has some very significant problems to confront as they go forward.
Right. And what do you think the long term game is here for the Russians? Let's talk about them possibly offering peace terms, things like that from both them and the
So I
Ukrainian
think
side.
right now, I think Russian gains are more maximalist. I think
Mm.
we should go back to what Putin has said. He wants to destroy Ukraine. He wants to stamp out its culture and absorb it into Russia. I see no reason to disbelieve that principle, and I think so. Having had a little success, and again making all these decisions essentially alone,
Mhm.
it's possible that Russian goals are now very large. And over the next 60, 90 days, what happens on the ground will determine if those goals are going to be, if he's going to have to back off those goals. I see no desire at all on the part of Putin to
Sure.
negotiate right now.
Well, particularly after this last election, there wasn't any major protests like
Correct.
there were in the past,
That's right.
actually. So we actually got back into
He's a
office with
wildly
a
popular leader, Ted. We know
right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, however he does that, we'll
that.
never know. But
Well, with an iron boot, Ted,
right.
but
Yeah. Oh
please.
yeah. Of course. Um, but with that in mind, what's the Ukrainian perspective and the long term objective? Hold the line until the Russians,
So
tire
I
out.
think I think Ukraine still has maximalist objectives too. They'd like to recover their territory in the east. They'd certainly like to recover Crimea down south. I think it's very difficult for them to get there right now.
Mhm.
Uh, But so what Ukraine needs to do is ride out this Russian attack, integrate this new equipment that they're getting. They're going to have, F-16s. They're going to have all kinds of capabilities. That will take a little while to be integrated if they're going to actually employ them effectively. So, and then they need to sit down and think very hard about what's an endurable end to this war. What's it
Sure.
going to be? Right now, Ted, I can't see them pushing them all the way out of eastern Ukraine
Right.
and Crimea. I don't think that's a reasonable military goal right now for for the Ukrainians. Now that could change, and this has changed before,
Sure.
but today that looks like a long road.
Right.
Uh, for the Russians, it looks like a long road too. So we come down to a question of who's going to have the resolve to stay in the fight. The Ukrainians have displayed deep resolve, but they're a small country under enormous attack. Russia has its own problems too, though, and
Right.
we shouldn't discount those.
Right. Like you said, that boot can only do so much.
Can only do so much.
And for the Ukrainians, though, aid's always been a problem coming from the West in the sense of not getting it on time or not
Right.
getting enough of it. So this last U.S. aid package that has been talked is this was the last aid package likely for the year for the Ukrainians. So how do they plan going forward when they're only getting in a sense
Right.
of a flow of aid? And then what's from the U.S. perspective is that going to look like, particularly as the U.S. Enters its election season?
So we should be talking to the Ukrainians. There should be no surprises for them on the level
Hmm.
of aid they're going to
Yeah,
expect.
sure.
The Ukrainians have to then they have to think in time. And we would in military planning, you'd look at the end state. What is it that you want to achieve?
Mhm.
How do you get there? What are the decisions and waypoints you have to pass in order to get to that? Now, look, it may be we're going to reclaim half the land the Russians have occupied in eastern Ukraine. That might be a reasonable
Sure.
objective. It might be that you want to reclaim a big chunk of Crimea, which I think is a difficult objective. You're probably going to have to then to prioritize between the two because
Mhm.
you're not going to have enough resources to do all of these things. And that is a political decision, not a military decision. And it needs to be a political decision, not a military decision. The military needs to be able to, in our system, we would have the opportunity to give advice on this, to discuss it. But ultimately, once the political decision is made, it's the military's business to execute.
Right, right. And what do you see any major breakdowns between that civ-mil relation in
In
Ukraine?
Ukraine,
Yep.
hard to see from a
Right.
distance. I know it's been under great stress, and that's what
Mhm.
happens when things are going well. It's
Right.
great.
Mm.
When things are going poorly, then you see the stress, and things are going poorly. So there's certainly stress in the system. I have hopes and confidence that
Sure.
Ukraine will pull through this, but nothing is a given.
And as we look forward with the war, what does this mean for other U.S. interests around the world? So as we look at U.S. aid packages to Israel, for example, and U.S. looking at Taiwan, how does that look
So I think
globally?
it's important, but we are a global power. We have global responsibilities. Our friends, allies, and partners around the world need to know that we're a stable, dependable partner. And that's very important because that's what gives assurance to your friends and deters your opponents,
Mhm.
is that view of the United States. And so people are watching, they watched aid to Israel very closely. They're watching aid to Ukraine very closely to determine, is the United States going to be a dependable partner?
Sure, sure. And as the U.S. is trying to be that dependent partner, what lessons is it taking away from the conflict in Ukraine? Let's say on the strategic level, but also on, like for example, in air defense on the air defense
Yeah.
side, when we see new technologies
I think there's
introduced.
a lot of new technologies that we're seeing exposed in Ukraine out there, mainly involving the use of drones and
Mm.
defending against drones. I think those are very important things. We've seen our anti tank systems work brilliantly.
Sure.
We've seen armored protected movement systems challenged greatly, but I believe the demise of the tank is not upon us. I think there's always going to be a requirement for protected maneuver on the battlefield, whether it's the tank or armored personnel carriers. You're certainly going to need them if you're going to talk about breaching fortified lines. We've seen the superiority of the defense
Sure.
demonstrated time and time again, but I'm not sure that the superiority of the defense is in and of itself a lesson to be learned, but rather that unless you generate a thoughtful, well put together combined arms attack, you're going to have problems. And I'm not sure that all the Ukrainian attacks demonstrated those characteristics.
Well, have the Russians attacks demonstrated
They
those?
have not either.
Right.
Although I think the Russians were much better dug in the
Hmm.
areas that the Ukrainians attacked. The Russians again have their own problems, though.
Sure.
Those problems: basic leadership, desire to fight, antiquated equipment, poor logistics. All of those things operate against the Russian army.
Right. And outside of that, what's going to be the nail in the coffin that finishes the Russian army? You think what could push them over the edge? Is it domestic issues?
So a lot of people have made judgments about the Russian army in the past,
Yeah, yeah.
particularly after the Finnish expedition
Yep.
in 1939, 1940. 4 years later, the Russian army was one of the best armies in the world. I would hesitate to pronounce the Russian army dead.
Okay.
But I will tell you this, the one thing that the Russian army will fight for and fight to the death on is the defense of Russia.
Sure.
So let's go back to a discussion we had at the beginning of our
Hmm.
conversation. You need to be careful what you do in Russia. You need to do enough to make it hard for the Russians to carry on operations in Ukraine, but you don't want to do so much that you create a new great patriotic war, because I have high confidence in the Russian army's ability to fight inside Russia. It's outside of Russia where I think motivation becomes a factor, where we draw an advantage. We the West, and particularly Ukraine, draws
Right.
an advantage when you fight the Russians.
Right. And that might going back to red lines, like we were
Yeah,
speaking of,
that's
that
correct.
would just put Putin in a much stronger position.
It would. It
Right.
would.
Those are lessons to be learned from the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, where they kind of slowly got worn down over time, lost motivation.
Right.
The mothers against soldiers going to
Right.
Afghanistan. So is
Right.
that part of a strategy that could be employed here?
Certainly, it certainly could be. Although the relentless clamp on information that
Hmm.
exists prevents that from getting out.
Yeah.
And I think that Putin has been very, very aggressive in the way he's controlled that information flow.
So, well, to wrap up, how do you see this going forward for the rest of the year on the front lines in Ukraine?
There's going to be a big back and forth here. Nothing's going to happen quickly.
Mm.
Um, Eventually, the side that's better able to integrate combined arms capabilities and choose and stick to an actual plan that makes strategic sense is going to be the side that's going to have the advantage.
All right. Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Tad.
And that wraps up another episode of What's Really Happening. Today, we discussed updates about the war in Ukraine and the new front line north of Kharkiv with GNSI Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next conversation when we find out what's really happening.